It is my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Tara Kate. Tara is a bird artist and illustrator who creates highly detailed drawings and paintings of Oregon birds and their habitats using graphite, colored pencil, and acrylics. Influenced by her background as a field ecologist, she depicts subtle details with biological accuracy. And in fact, Tara just shared with me that she has a PhD and has done tons of fieldwork all over. So she is very much familiar and intimate with these birds, having had many of them in the hand, I'm sure. So Tara, thank you so much for joining us tonight to share your work and your perspective on how art can contribute to bird conservation.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be here tonight. Thank you everyone for coming. It's really a real pleasure to be here this evening and to share my artwork with you, as well as my perspective on what I'm calling the beauty of science. So as a birder or someone who's interested in birds, you probably have a very keen awareness of birds in your environment. And if you observe birds very often, what you'll find is that you get to see events or occurrences in birds' lives that other people may not witness outside of, say, a documentary or a YouTube video. Take, for example, the scrub jay. Now, we here out in the West are graced to see California scrub jays quite a lot, and certainly here in the Corvallis area. I live in Corvallis, Oregon. Scrub jays are one of the most common birds in my area. They're very vocal, so we hear them a lot and we see them constantly. And I think you'll agree that one scrub jay looks very much like another scrub jay. In fact, we'd probably all be very hard pressed to tell one individual bird from another. And yet there is something unique about this particular bird. There's a small but distinctive detail that makes this bird unique. Can you tell what it is? Well, if you missed it, don't worry. Its right leg was broken and has healed. You can see that there's a distortion in the tarsus that's indicated by this white arrow. And if you were to see the bird face on, you would be able to tell that this tarsus is bowed outward. I don't know if you've ever seen a bird who has an injury like this one, but when I first observed this bird at my studio, the injury was quite fresh and I must admit rather disturbing to look at. The bird could fly and it could forage, but it couldn't use its right leg at all. And although it was able to forage, I really had doubts as to whether or not it was going to be able to survive. However, it did. And over the next few weeks after I had made the initial observation of its injury, I watched its leg slowly heal. So for about 18 months, nearly 2 years, I was able to see this bird often. And because it looked different from the other scrub jays in this area, with that very unique looking leg, I could tell it apart from other birds, and I grew really quite fond of it. I was always glad to see it whenever it visited my garden, and honestly, I still look for it every time I see a scrub jay come to get peanuts when I put those out for them. But I'm pretty sure that this bird has either moved on or has gone on to wherever birds go when they pass from this life to the next. Now, as a biologist, one could learn a great deal about scrub jays from literature searches, and we can learn a lot about their life history from things about the size of their brains, to the length of their lives, to their very interesting social behavior. In fact, that they seem to have some understanding that there's something amiss when a bird has died. And the way that we know these things is because scientists have studied populations of scrub jays. They've looked at large numbers of birds, and they've collected data over sometimes many years in order to compile and analyze data and understand these things about birds. So a scientist is interested in populations of birds, and I have been a scientist, and I too have spent lots of time looking at large numbers of animals. But now as an artist, my perspective is quite different. Now, when a scientist looks at a bird like mine, the scientist might ask questions like, how often do birds get these kinds of injuries, and what sorts of injuries occur to wild birds? And they also might want to understand how birds survive such injuries. In fact, Douglas and I, my husband and I, observed a white-crowned sparrow recently with a dislocated leg. So, how often do they get these sorts of injuries, and how do these injuries occur for these birds? And one might also wonder, well, what are the causes of mortality for birds in the wild. Is it window collisions? Is it cats? Is it disease? And these are all very interesting questions. But as an artist, I ask a very different question. And that question is, how can I tell this bird's story? One of the ways I can tell this bird's story is to use composition to visually construct a story or provide an image that would support a larger narrative. By using position and pose, I can create a sense of action and connection. And you'll hear me use that word connection a lot through this evening's talk. And by giving the viewer access to a scene that they might not normally experience themselves, I also try to evoke emotion and intimacy. And these are all very important aspects of the illustrative work that I do. So to illustrate this injured scrub jay, I wanted to create a composition that made it very clear to the viewer that there was something wrong with the bird. So I chose to show its right leg in this rather awkward position, both to draw attention to it and also communicate that the distortion of the tarsus was likely due to some sort of injury. I depicted the bird's head as turned slightly toward the viewer in order to create a sense of interaction and to perhaps invite compassion toward the injured bird. And this illustration is a very good example of a larger question I often ask myself, which is, how can my art be used to raise awareness and contribute to the protection and conservation of birds? Today, I'd like to share with you my perspective on what I refer to as the beauty of science, how artists can collaborate with scientists and birders and naturalists and those who are interested in the environment and conservation to create compelling imagery that not only helps to inform and educate, but also might help to form emotional connections that could motivate protection and conservation. Briefly, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I became a birder in my mid-20s when I was observing hawks perched on fence posts along a highway. So my first exposure to bird illustration was through field guides. Eventually, my birding hobby became my career, and I earned a PhD in biology from the University of Illinois. During my academic career, I was a field biologist and also a research professor. So I started out in behavioral ecology, and I studied social behavior in song wrens of central Panama, fascinating little brown birds. And then I contributed to studies on life history evolution in both tropical and temperate birds. In fact, I worked on violet-green swallows here in Oregon. I also taught genetics through the eCampus program at Oregon State University for about 10 years. While I had a lifelong desire to be an artist, I didn't really make art consistently until about 10 years ago. So I am not formally trained. I did not go to art school. Instead, I used self-directed learning primarily through online offerings, but also in-person workshops, as well as many, many hours of dedicated practice. I became a full-time artist about 6.5 years ago. My husband, Douglas Robinson, is a professional ornithologist. So we are all things bird at our house. Birds are very much a part of our daily lives. In fact, so much so that when we got our puppy last year, we named him Finch. And while I'm no longer a birder, at least I don't think of myself as being a birder so much anymore, I certainly have a keen awareness of birds in my environment. And I observe birds constantly, either out while I'm out hiking or out with Douglas or out in the back garden of my studio. And because birds just sort of permeate my life in all directions, that they were a very natural choice for my artistic specialty. And as a biologist, I think that my knowledge and understanding of ecology really contributes a great deal to my artistic choices and also helps me to envision narrative and context for my artwork. Take, for example, these 3 northern rough-winged swallows. My husband took several photos of these birds in the fall of 2020. And as soon as I looked at these photos, I observed that the uppermost bird, the one that we can really see the whole bird on, has a very yellow prominent gape. And that told me that these are newly fledged birds. So these birds have fledged sometime probably in the months or 2 months prior to when this photograph was taken. And given the time of year and what I know about their biology, I hypothesized that these might even be siblings beginning their very first migratory journey southward. As you probably know, migration is a very dangerous time for birds. And not only is it highly likely that these three birds will never see one another again, that they'll become parted from one another at some time during their journey, but also one or more of them may not even survive the journey southward or back north to our state of Oregon to return to the breeding grounds in the following season. So when creating the composition for the resulting drawing, I envisioned their thorny perch as a symbol for the dangers that these birds face and must overcome as their all too short lives unfold. One of my favorite details of this drawing is this middle bird whose eye just peeps out just over the bramble. And I depicted the lowermost bird as peering directly at the viewer, both to make the scene more interactive as well as more intimate, almost as if the bird is saying, "I see you. Do you see me?" When I look at a bird, I'm often aware that I may be the only person who looks at that animal and sees an individual deserving of dignity. Think for a moment about the importance that we humans place on that kind of individual recognition. Recall a moment or a time when you felt truly seen and appreciated for who you really are. Why is it that many people seem to believe that humans are deserving of being seen and appreciated as individuals, but animals, particularly wild animals, are not? Artists often take the role of calling attention to questions such as these. And this ability to play provocateur is part of artistic license. It grants the artist the opportunity to influence the viewer's perspective and opinion. And this is one of the ways that art can contribute to biology. As an illustrator, I can create an image of an event that tells a story that is true but not factual. So just here in this stylized ink drawing of a pied kingfisher, holding a very startled looking fish. Here's another example. In September of 2020, Oregon experienced a horrific wildfire season. I know that you folks in California can really relate. I felt very frightened and sad and helpless, and I wanted to express how I was feeling through my art. And as I considered how I might do that, I thought of blackback woodpeckers, as only a bird biologist might. As you might know, blackback woodpeckers are a fire-dependent species. They arrive very soon after wildfire, even as the trees are still smoldering. And inspired by this knowledge, I sketched an imaginary yet probable scene. A newly arrived blackback woodpecker in the area near Mount Jefferson, Oregon, which you can see in the lower right, with smoke billowing up in the background. I knew that my audience on social media was likely to know nothing whatsoever about blackback woodpeckers, so here's how I captioned it. While my home state of Oregon's forests burn and I mourn the loss of lives and homes and forests, and what seems like the last shred of normalcy in this year, I can't help but think about blackback woodpeckers. Blackback woodpeckers arrive in burned forest before the fires are even out. Some biologists think they can smell smoke. No matter how they find them, these enterprising birds are the first to colonize the newly burned forests. And in the coming years, they'll make their homes there. And by the time they leave, just a few years later, there will be new seedlings and wildflowers and all sorts of birds and animals thriving in the recovering burns. So the blackback woodpecker is my symbol of hope. Hope for recovery, hope for restoration, and hope for Oregon. I got many wonderful comments, but this one stood out. I told my son about this drawing and about the blackback woodpecker, and then he felt inspired to write about it and share it with his 6th grade class. Such a beautiful ripple effect. And this is just one of the reasons why I believe and hope that scientists and birders and naturalists and artists can become collaborators. There are many arguments for why we should preserve biodiversity. You've probably heard lots of these. And the aesthetic argument is only one of these. However, it is our uniquely human capacity for recognizing and appreciating beauty that creates such a powerful emotional connection between us and nature. I see this as the beauty of science and the role of art in the service to the protection and conservation of natural populations. Through collaboration, biologists, birders, environmentalists, artists can help to create a more informed public, but perhaps even more importantly, an emotionally engaged public. While we hope that people make decisions based on sound reasoning, the truth is that much of how science is perceived and experienced by the public is on a completely and purely emotional level. Art connects us emotionally. This is one of my favorite drawings, by the way. Executed in pencil, the subdued color palette of this rock wren evokes the calm demeanor of the tiny bird. The composition of this piece is very simple, drawing the eye to the details of a resting migrant songbird. The shadows of the bird's feet on the rocks provide a subtle cue to the relaxed bearing of the subject. You may have noticed this. Birds grip their perches tightly when they're agitated or about to take flight. However, the toes of the left foot of this bird on the viewer's right are actually hovering above the substrate, communicating balance, repose, and serenity. Art communicates. In this acrylic painting, a burrowing owl scowls at the viewer while surrounded by lush, colorful poppies. I named this painting Prickly, not only because the stems and leaves of the flowers are covered in spines, but the owl itself seems quite prickly as he gazes very directly at the viewer from beneath his shaggy eyebrows. What do you suppose he's thinking about us? It's that imagined experience of being in conversation with the subject that I intended when I created this composition. Art tells stories. This painting is entitled Ride Sharing. It was created as a graduation gift for one of my husband's PhD students. Her favorite bird, he told me, is a Cory bustard. And quite frankly, I had never heard of a Cory bustard before. When I started doing research, I found out that not only are these African savanna residents, but they are the heaviest flying birds. And as I started looking at their photos, I started wondering, how am I going to make this bird feel accessible? But then I saw a photo taken by a birder, it happened to be on eBird, of a bustard with a carmine bee eater hitching a ride on its back. The bee eaters ride on the bustard's back, and as they stroll through the grass, as bugs fly up, the bee eaters sally out and catch the bugs. So I added a second bee eater, second carmine bee eater on the right, turned slightly toward the viewer to create some interaction between the viewer and the subject. One of the rules of dynamic artistic composition is to work in odd numbers, especially threes. So after consulting eBird again, looking at checklists to make sure that I chose a species that would co-occur with bustards and carmine bee eaters, I found this little green bee eater and placed it on the bustard's crest. For a bit of whimsy, I'm pretty sure that green bee eaters do not ride on bustards' crests. I placed the bustard in a very cropped composition to bring the bird very close to the viewer in the foreground of the painting, as well as to create a sense that the bustard and her passengers are passing by us as she walks through the thick tufts of grass. I chose the title Ride Sharing because it's a common phrase and it helps stimulate the viewer's imagination about the story I'm telling. I'll also say as an aside, this was executed in watercolor and colored pencil. It's a rather large piece. It's about 20 by 20 square inches. And I feel like I know every single blade of grass in this savanna personally, because it took quite a long time to draw every single one of them. One of the reasons perhaps not to choose colored pencil on such a drawing in the future. Art is approachable. When Douglas asked me if I'd be willing to create an illustration for a local birdathon, I searched eBird and found a yawning burrowing owl. After contacting the birder for permission to use the photo, I drew this sleepy owl using my iPad and an app called Procreate. The resulting illustration is a warm and intimate portrait that is quite different from the painting of the burrowing owl you saw earlier. So in conclusion, if you are artistically inclined, I strongly urge you to develop your skills. I don't believe in talent. So if you think talent is holding you back, don't worry about it. I only believe in drive and hard work. In fact, on the left, here is one of my very first attempts at drawing a bird in 2016, a barely recognizable cactus wren, showing no talent whatsoever. And on the right, a wren tit that I drew about 5 years later. The difference between these drawings is not talent. It's just many, many hours of fierce, dedicated practice. So if you want to learn to paint or draw, find a good teacher and practice consistently. As a birder, a naturalist, or someone who cares about the environment, you have a unique perspective, and art will give you a very fulfilling and satisfying way to express that viewpoint. I also encourage you, when you're observing the natural world, to allow its beauty to affect you. Beauty is important. And as birders and naturalists, we are privileged to be immersed in nature's beauty far more often than the average person is likely to be. And because we see it all the time, it can be very tempting to take this beauty for granted. But I believe we have a responsibility to this beauty, to share it with others to the degree that we can, and to communicate its importance and its fragility. Nature's beauty is vulnerable, and the conversations that we have with others may play a vital role in protecting and conserving it. Certainly, beauty is subjective, but I would argue that it provides us with a shared experience and a common ground from which to begin conversations, particularly with those whose value systems about the natural world differ from our own. And as a birder, I would encourage you to share your photos with eBird. And if an artist asks to use one of your photos, please say yes, especially if that artist is me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was absolutely wonderful. And I think your artwork is really gorgeous. It was really a pleasure to see so many of these different pieces that you've created. And I think it's inspiring to see, you know, how you started and how you got here, learn a little bit about your background and how you pivoted your career. And I know that I am personally inspired to start picking up a pencil again and draw just for fun every so often. So I hope everyone in the audience agrees with that. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
All right. Well, we can start with some questions in the chat here, and I see that one just came in. So Kate asks, do you have any suggestions for online drawing courses?
So many. Actually, John Muir-Laws, who's going to be doing a presentation for your group, has a very fine YouTube channel, and also offers classes. And I think he's also got a book on drawing birds. There are many, many resources and places to get started. I think one of the best ways to get started, really, though, is just to get plain old copy paper and an ordinary number 2 pencil, and really make it as non-precious as possible, and just allow yourself to start playing and looking at shapes and looking at I think there's something very empowering about just cheap paper, cheap pencil, making it not precious, so that you're not afraid to mess up and to just show up day after day after day.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, someone put in a comment that your drawings are very nice, and it's good to know that practice does wonders with increasing skill. Yeah, and then we have another question here related to that. So how do you suggest, if you become as skilled as yourself, to make the move to being a professional artist? Is this sustaining as a career?
Absolutely, it's sustaining as a career. I certainly know many professional artists who are making a living at it. And there's certainly a number of different ways to do that. I'm a natural history illustrator. So just to kind of define the distinction, scientific illustration is very precise and to scale, and very precise measurements, and getting every detail absolutely perfectly correct. As a natural history illustrator, I have a little bit more room to express a little bit more style and express things maybe a little bit less in terms of like perfect photographic detail. But there are many ways to make a living from editorial illustration, natural history illustration, magazines, websites use illustrators. And then there's also children's books. I think that there's wonderful opportunities for people to even do quite realistic illustrations for children's books. There are some children's books that are obviously very highly stylized, but there's others that show illustrations in quite style that's much more realistic. So I think there are lots of different ways to do it. And of course, one can also sell art, teach art. So I think there's a lot of different income streams for artists these days. And I think it's a really good time to be an artist these days because we do have so many options.
Yeah, that's really great to know. I'm sure for people who have considered that this as a career, it's good to know that there are those options available and that it's possible to make it, to make a living out of it. So thank you so much for answering that. Oh, and then Jan here has a comment. Your emphasis on individual birds is exciting and something we only access with close observation, which reminds him of our banding station at Coyote Creek. So I mentioned to Tara earlier that we actually do operate a bird banding station, and Tara, of course, is very familiar with bird banding with her career as a scientist. The power of banding is to track individuals, even though simultaneously data is viewed in the aggregate. So yeah, that's a really great parallel. Is there anything that you want to add to that, Tara?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that was so much fun about the work I did for my PhD was I had a large population of banded birds on a rainforest site in central Panama. If any of your folks have ever been to central Panama and visited Pipeline Road, my site was on the famous Pipeline Road, which is still quite a birding destination for people who travel to central Panama. And because these birds are sedentary, so they don't migrate and they hold year-round territories, I got to watch banded birds over long periods of time and in fact, I even thanked one bird by its band designation in my thesis because I learned so much from observing that one individual bird. And I think that may be kind of part of where this came from for me. It's coming from science and you're trained to get away from story or anecdote. But now as an illustrator, I get to kind of immerse myself in story and look for how am I going to tell, even like the project I'm doing now is I'm illustrating a book on birds, but I'm still even thinking about, how am I telling this animal's story? How am I making this composition dynamic or give the viewer this sense of interaction with the subject, which is quite different from the way field guide illustration is done. For example, where birds are, depicted in poses that are rather stereotyped and often in profile, because people want to see the field marks, and you've got to see how to identify this bird. And now I get to play with things and ask myself, okay, how do I make this bird look dynamic? Or I just finished illustrating a prairie falcon, and so how am I going to make this bird look fierce and really kind of fly out of the page for the viewer? So yeah, it's really fun.
Yeah, and to your point earlier about making that connection, having that emotional reaction, it's important, for people to not just know about, things like you were mentioning, field marks, et cetera, but that connection is what gets people to care about the birds too and start paying attention, right?
Absolutely.
And then we have a question here from Orr. I'm curious if your art has ever spurred conversations with people who have very different views of conservation than you, and if you could share one such conversation with us and how you handled that.
Trying to think if I've ever really, the times that I've had exhibitions, it was at openings and things like that. So I was generally talking to friends and neighbors. I cannot think of an example, but let that percolate. One might pop up for me.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
That is a good question.
In the meanwhile, Melanie asked if you work from photographs, and are you able to work from specimens as well?
I have done both, yes. So I do work from photographs. Drawing from life for birds is quite challenging because obviously they don't sit still for very long. So I work from photographs often we'll start out with a photograph from either a collection of photographs my husband has taken, or some other friend has taken, or that I've taken, also from Wikimedia Commons, and then supplementing that with lots of other photographs from other sources to make sure that I'm seeing all the details that I need to see. There are times when I do work from specimens and do get to visit the collection here at Oregon State from time to time to take photographs of specific bird parts, especially bills and feet.
Well, I have heard from other budding artists that sometimes they'll have like problem areas, right? Areas of the bird that they tend to find more challenging. And sometimes that does include the feet or the bills too. Have you had similar experiences where maybe a certain part of a bird tends to be a little more challenging for you to illustrate than others?
Oh, I think a lot of artists are afraid of bird feet. And so the way that I got past my fear of bird feet was I just put myself through a study of drawing feet every day for weeks, literally, going through many different photographs and trying to really look at feet from all different angles, and also pulling up, there's the Manual of Ornithology that's, I don't know if that book is still in print or not, but a wonderful book that shows the anatomy and shows the skeletal features, and then shows all the investments on the outside of the feet, because bird feet are covered with scutes and scales, and so not all feet look alike. There's different shapes, there's different toe arrangements, and now I quite love drawing bird feet. But it was at first, and I have seen other professional artists who, when they get to the feet, just kind of punt, because I think they're just intimidated. And I think also bills, because bills are, show up in foreshortened poses and look actually very different from how they look in profile, that bills can sometimes present some real challenges for drawing as well.
Yeah, and just as Melanie was saying, I was thinking the same thing, that human hands are kind of similar to in the way that people often will shy away from them. Just
absolutely.
Like, yeah.
It's all that foreshortening. We get just freaked out by the foreshortening.
All right. Well, those are all the questions that I'm seeing so far in the chat, but if anybody has any others that they want to share, please go ahead and do that. Tara, is there anything that you would recommend for everyone, if they want to, you mentioned like if people have any interest in drawing, right, and art, that they should just go ahead and do it, just practice it, right? Practice makes perfect. Are there any other things that you can think of that you would recommend for people to do, whether they want to get into art or they want to be helping birds or finding some connection between the two?
Great question, and I kind of got distracted by the chat, so I'll apologize for a second. I think one of the things I said, that every time I go back over this talk and I think about how important I believe beauty is. I was in conversation with some artists a couple of weeks ago that I got to do an interview, and we were talking about just daily practice and sketchbook practice. And one of the things that came up was whether or not, we should be producing work for social media. And one of the things I would encourage anyone, in our current social environment, is make the investment in yourself first, and be willing to allow yourself to experience nature and beauty, and that mindful experience of being out in the world. I think sometimes, especially birders, get kind of caught up in checking off things on the list, or maybe, if you're involved in counting, that you're just like, got to count the ducks. But there's also this part of our lives that I think, if we are really attuned to nature's beauty and it starts to affect us, then different things come out of that. For me, it was becoming an artist. For somebody else, it might be, motivating them to take some kind of action in favor of birds, or to have a conversation with somebody when an area is blocked off for nesting terms, or something to help people to understand why this is important, why that we care, what are the reasons we want to preserve biodiversity. And like I said, aesthetic argument is one of those reasons, but there are lots of reasons to preserve biodiversity. And I think the more that we're immersed in nature and the more we kind of understand these different arguments, the more different ways that we can lend our support and help. And I do quite strongly believe that even looking at an animal and appreciating it for who it really is, and just appreciating its isness in the world, is an important thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely agreed with that. And I think a lot of people in our audience would too. And so just to bring it into another question that came up, more related to the technical side of drawing, I suppose. What about difficulty of eye placement? Do you have any advice for that?
I absolutely do. I do still use what's called a proportional divider, and I don't have it in here with me, but if anyone Googles proportional divider, you'll see that they come in many different shapes and sizes. I would recommend just a small plastic one to start. And it's a very, very helpful tool for measuring proportions and learning then to measure by eye. One of the difficulties in drawing by eye and measuring by eye is that one has to get comfortable with making measurements and transferring that measurement that you're seeing on whatever reference you're using, and then transferring that to the page. And the proportional divider is a tool that will help you to get over that hump. And with practice, I found that I need it less and less. Occasionally, I still pull it out. I was struggling with proportions on a barn swallow yesterday, got out the proportional divider and measured proportions just to make sure that I was, figuring out where I was going wrong. But it's a wonderful tool for helping people to learn how to draw. And there's nothing wrong with measuring things, and nothing wrong with, at one point I was measuring things down to the point of like using a protractor just to get angles right, because sometimes I find those very challenging. So there's nothing wrong with using tools like that. And the proportional divider is a wonderfully helpful tool. Another artist friend of mine is the one that told me about it, and it works great.
Yeah, thanks so much for that tip. It sounds like it's going to be helpful for other folks too. And while we're thinking about the eye, I'm curious too, because I've been hearing from other artists that the eye is really what brings a bird to life too, right? So some people draw it first, some people draw it last. What's your approach when it comes to the eye?
I always do the eye first. I absolutely do the eye first. In part because it does make the bird make it seem very alive. And I find that to be very motivating and engaging for me artistically. And I also have a stylistic thing that I do. If you look at a lot of photographs of birds, you'll notice that the pupil is often not seen in photographs because the color of the iris is so dark, but the pupil is actually always present. It's just the value contrast between the bird's eye color and the pupil sometimes don't allow you to see it. But I always draw the pupil in on all of my drawings. And so it's a little stylistic consideration that's kind of like my own thing, but I really try to pay attention to, birds' eyes kind of bulge or out from their heads a bit because of the way that they're pressed in by this little bony ring. The orbital ring, which is literally bones in the eye, not over the eye, but actually in the eye itself. And so, getting that shine and roundness, and also adding that pupil in, as you can tell, I love details. I'm really quite fond of details. And yes, the eye is one of my things for sure.
Nice. Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. Just the approach to the eye. That's amazing. All right. Well, I think that is the last question we have for the moment. So again, thank you so much, Tara, for this wonderful talk and for answering all those great questions. Is there anything else that you'd want to share with everybody before we sign off for the evening?
Well, I would be happy to invite people to visit my website. It's tarakatedesigns.com. I do have a drawing class online that people can take, and a YouTube channel if you're interested in learning more about the illustration journey and the kind of work that I do, that's a good place to start.
Fantastic. I will be sure to send out that link to everybody after the end of the talk. So once again, thank you everybody so much for joining us this evening for our very first event of the year. We really appreciate you coming back because I see a lot of familiar names, or if this is your first event, welcome. Thanks so much for tuning in. So once again, thank you all. And thank you again, Tara. It's been a real pleasure listening to your talk and seeing your wonderful, beautiful artwork.
Thank you. This was great. Thanks for having me. And thank you everyone for attending.